Story number 1. This story happened in 2020 during the lockdown. My wife worked at the hospital, so during this time we were scared since we didn't know much about the virus yet. Therefore, when my wife came home, she would wash thoroughly before touching our baby daughter, Shelley. She usually got home around 12 a.m. By this time, the baby was already sleeping in the crib in our room. Since the baby was in our room, we usually didn't have the baby monitor on at night. We only used the baby monitor when the baby was taking a nap, and we weren't in the bedroom with her. One day I had a cough and a mild fever, so I took a home test, which came out negative. However, sometimes people with a negative test result can get a positive result a few days later, confirming they have the virus. I was afraid, and my wife was concerned. A few days ago, before I developed a cough, I was doing our laundry. My wife had been in contact with patients with the virus, so I thought maybe I might get the virus from her clothes or something. I was having some symptoms, so I decided to sleep on the couch instead of being in the room since I had a mild cough. My wife came home at 12 a.m., and she was tired. She knew about my situation, so she understood that I'd be sleeping on the couch that night. However, I had the baby monitor with me in case my wife couldn't hear when the baby cried at night due to being exhausted from work. That night at 3 a.m., I heard our 8-month-old baby, Shelley, cry. I looked at the baby monitor and saw her standing up, holding onto the crib while crying. I let her cry for 2 minutes, and then I saw a lady with curly hair in a white hospital gown grab Shelley out of the crib. I thought that person didn't look like my wife since my wife has short Karen-style hair. I got up, put on my mask, and walked to our bedroom door. I slowly opened the door and saw my wife turning on the lamp by her side of the bed. She started breastfeeding Shelley and then looked at me strangely and said, "Didn't you just put the baby next to me?" She asked me that because she saw me coming in instead of going out of the bedroom. I froze for a bit and then stuttered, "I thought I saw you get the baby out of the crib." We just looked at each other, and she knew she hadn't gotten the baby out of the crib. That night, my wife made me sleep in the bedroom with them, but I had to wear a mask due to my coughing. The next morning while we were having breakfast, my wife told me about a 36-year-old lady who had some child labor bleeding complications and died in the intensive care unit where she worked. My wife and a nurse did after-death care for that patient. The soul of that lady might have followed my wife home. That was the one time I experienced anything creepy with the baby monitor. Story number 2. My grandma was very sick due to old age and kidney failure. She was sent home from the hospital after she refused treatments. That same day she was sent home was the same day that my wife and I went to the hospital because she was having contractions. When my grandma got home, she knew that my wife and I had just left for the hospital. My grandma had been saying that she couldn't wait to see our baby boy. Everyone had been having baby girls for the past 2 years, so my grandma was excited that we would be having a baby boy. That day at the hospital, my wife gave birth to our baby boy, JV. Unfortunately, JV aspirated a mixture of amniotic fluid and meconium. Therefore, he had to stay at the hospital longer for treatments. After almost a week, my grandma passed away while JV was still at the hospital. She never got to see her great-grandson. My wife and I were in and out of the hospital to see JV. But after my grandma died, my wife went to see JV alone while I was helping my family with the funeral. We had a 3-day funeral from Friday to Sunday, and then buried my grandma at the cemetery on Monday. On Tuesday, JV was discharged home with my wife and me, as he was doing great and breathing normally. That night, around 10 p.m., my wife finished breastfeeding, and JV fell asleep. My wife put JV down in his crib and then came back out to watch Netflix with me in the living room. It was right around 10:37 p.m. when my wife and I heard my grandma's voice on the baby monitor. We heard her voice with some static, but she was saying something along the lines of, "My boy looks so adorable." I grabbed the baby monitor and started rotating the camera around the bedroom to see if my grandma was in there. We didn't see anything around the room. JV was sleeping still. I looked around more, and on the white curtain was this big insect that looked like a large grasshopper. Both my wife and I saw this, so we went in and turned on the light, but there was nothing in the room. The grasshopper was gone. I told this encounter to my mother, and she said that when someone dies, they can come back as an animal or insect to visit their family before they depart to the afterlife. I hope it's true what my mom said. Even though it's scary, at least my grandma got to see her great-grandson before she departed to the afterlife. Thank you for listening to my story. Story number 3. My wife and I have a son named Tyler. When we had Tyler, my wife got an old baby monitor from her friend. She installed the baby monitor in Tyler's room. However, I'm a tech guy, so I prefer a set of cameras instead of an old baby monitor. Therefore, I ordered a set of cameras to install around the house. That way, when Tyler begins to walk, we can monitor him in other rooms too. I installed the cameras in almost everyone except the bathrooms. The cameras are linked to our iPhones, so we would get a notification whenever there's noises and movements in any of the rooms where the cameras were installed. Initially, Tyler slept in the same room with my wife and me, but after a few months we moved him into his own room. That's when strange things start to happen. One night, my wife and I were in bed, and I was still awake when I got a notification that there's a lot of noises in Tyler's room. I looked at the camera in Tyler's room and I could hear that he was crying. I got up and started walking towards his room, but the crying stopped before I got there. I looked at my iPhone and zoomed in. Tyler sounded asleep. Maybe he was having a bad dream or something. I'm a night owl, so I usually hear when Tyler cries, and ever since moving him to his own room, he has been crying a lot. One day my wife was at work, and it was actually our anniversary. I want to surprise her, so I asked my older brother and his wife if they can take Tyler to sleep over at their place for one night. I want to plan something for my wife and surprise her when she gets home. My older brother and his wife were okay with it and thought it was a good idea. That night, I planned a little surprise for my wife and took her out once she got home from work. We got back home late, took a shower, and went to bed. It was late, and my wife and I were about to fall asleep when we both got notification that there's a lot of noises in Tyler's room. I opened my phone to look at it, and we both can hear the crying. The same cry as Tyler, but Tyler wasn't even in his room that night. We got out of our room to go check, and we could still hear the crying from Tyler's room. But once we got closer, the crying stopped. We opened the door to Tyler's room, and no one was there. We were both worried that it could be a sign that something might have happened to Tyler at my brother's house. Both my wife and I rushed over to my brother's house in the middle of the night, as my wife was trying to call them while in the passenger seat. They didn't live too far from us. Once we got there, we were told that Tyler was sleeping in my nephew's room, and Tyler was okay. My nephew said Tyler hasn't cried at all. We went to check on Tyler and he was okay. My wife and I told my older brother and his wife what happened back at our place. We were advised to consult a shaman. That week, my wife and I consulted a shaman and invited him over to our place. When the shaman came, he sensed that there's another baby in our house. The spirit of this baby is angry and sad. The shaman asked my wife and I if we ever have another baby besides Tyler. We told the shaman that Tyler was our first one. However, when my wife and I were still dating and working towards our career, we've gotten pregnant and actually aborted the baby. Come to think of it, Tyler is actually our second one, but we did abort our first pregnancy. The shaman warned my wife and I that we must throw a feast along with a shamanic ritual to send the spirit of our unborn child away to the afterlife. Since our unborn child never has a proper funeral, it still lingers in our world. Therefore, by offering a feast and some joss papers, our unborn baby will be able to move on and be reincarnated to parents that actually love him or her. After we did a feast and the shaman performed a ritual, we no longer heard the crying at night. Story number 4. In 2001, my wife and I got a baby monitor for our baby Kathy. At first, she was sleeping with us. However, when she was around 10 months old, she no longer woke up in the middle of the night. Therefore, my wife and I thought it was time to start training her to sleep in her own room, using the baby monitor to keep an eye on her. We got a baby monitor from Best Buy and installed it in Kathy's room. For the first few nights, everything was fine. However, we started getting static and interference with the baby monitor. Sometimes we would hear something similar to old movies from the 70s. We heard static and sometimes talking, but Kathy would be sleeping soundly, so my wife and I thought it was just interference from other electronic devices in our area. The talking we heard from the baby monitor had some kind of old background music to it. That's why I thought it was just our baby monitor or another device in our area interfering with it. One late night, my wife was woken by Kathy crying. She was tired but looked at the baby monitor, hoping that Kathy would just go back to sleep by herself. Kathy was crying. Then she got up into a sitting position, and her cry became laughter instead. It was weird. My wife was about to fall asleep when she heard two different voices saying to each other, "It's your turn." "No, it's your turn again." My wife sat up and realized that Kathy was now standing up, holding onto the crib and looking at the corner. She rotated the camera towards that corner, and it was empty except for a dark, dense fog or shadow hanging there in the shape of a triangle. She rotated the camera back to look at Kathy, who was kind of jumping a little as she stared into that dark corner. My wife woke me up to go check on Kathy because she heard voices coming from her room. I got up and went to Kathy's room, and she was still holding onto the crib. There was nothing in that little corner. I brought Kathy back to sleep, with us in our room. The next day, my wife told me about the voices, and I said it was probably just interference from other devices in our area. In that little house we lived in at the time, the landlord had a big storage shed in the backyard, right next to an orange tree. One day, I was home alone with Kathy, while my wife was running some errands with her parents. We were in the backyard, and I filled up a toddler inflatable pool and put some water in it for Kathy. Our landlord, Mark, came by to get some stuff out of the shed. He loaded some things into his truck, then pulled out a box from the shed, opened it, and took out 2 puppets. He approached us with the puppets and made them talk to each other in 2 different voices. Kathy seemed to enjoy it. After that, Mark told me that his son used to put on puppet shows for kids at the local school, until he died in a car crash from drinking and driving. That's when Mark and his wife took over the property, and the puppets in the box belonged to his son, who used to live in this house. I had mixed feelings after hearing that. However, my wife and I haven't experienced anything unusual since the night she heard voices on the baby monitor. Story number 5. My husband and I have 2 kids, Tony and Michelle, during the time this event happened. Tony was almost 3 years old, and Michelle was 6 months old. Therefore, Michelle slept with my husband and me, while Tony slept in his own room inside his crib. My husband and I had actually thought of moving Tony out of the crib into a toddler bed, because he had been trying to climb out of the crib sometimes. We didn't want him to climb up, fall, and injure himself. However, switching him to a toddler bed might not be a good idea, because he might get up in the middle of the night and barge into our room, waking up Michelle. Therefore, we kept Tony in his crib. My husband worked the night shift, so I was alone most nights. I remember one night around 2 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of laughter coming from the baby monitor. When I looked, Tony wasn't in the crib. I was freaked out. I started rotating the camera around the room and saw Tony coming in and out of his closet. The door to his bedroom was still closed. Then I noticed that Tony would go into the closet and come out wearing shorts, then go back in and come back out wearing the pajamas I had put on him last night. How did he change his clothes that fast? I was confused, but on closer look, the kid in the short was not Tony. He was probably the same age or a bit younger. I got up quietly with the baby monitor and walked towards Tony's room. By this time, the laughter coming from the baby monitor had stopped. Before I opened the door to his room, I looked at the baby monitor again. The closet door was closed. I rotated the camera back to the crib, and Tony was still there, sound asleep. It was so strange, but I think I was just sleep deprived, and it must have been a dream. But I swear I was awake, and I saw what I saw on the baby monitor. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.